Hi, welcome to Tiny Garage Fabrication. Do you have an older car that's worth saving, something that's really cool, kind of unique, but the suspension is completely shot? Now, if you're like me, that's completely frustrating. I need to rebuild the suspension on my 1989 Toyota Camry All-Track. This is a fairly rare car, and unfortunately, rear struts are not available anywhere, period. There's nothing I can do to replace them, with the exception of buying some expensive coilovers for another car and modifying them to fit my car. I'm not really down with that because I don't want to have to modify something. And also, I've got coilovers in another one of my classic Toyotas, and honestly, they're oversprung and overdamped, and they just beat the crap out of me all the time. I want my Camry to be a plush, near factory ride. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my blown rear struts and I'm going to convert them into rebuildable struts that use off-the-shelf, comfortable, daily drivable strut inserts. There's going to be a few other things I'll do with that as well, but basically I will show you how to convert a non-rebuildable strut into a rebuildable and customizable strut. All right, let's get to work. So I'm going to go over how to take non-serviceable struts like this and make them serviceable struts or add strut inserts to them. What I mean by non-serviceable is this is not removable. This whole section is welded in, and so the internal shock body cannot be replaced. Not normally. So one would generally just buy an entire replacement strut. However, for my car and for a lot of older cars now, replacement struts are completely not available. In no way, shape, or form can you get a new one. So really the only option is to do some fabrication and make this a serviceable shock, which is cool because then you can get any type of inserts you want. You can get performance inserts or factory inserts or whatever, and you can tune your suspension on the cheap-ish. So not only am I going to change this to an insert type, I'm also going to lower it a little bit, and in that lowering I want to put a shorter strut cartridges, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, things you're going to need, you're going to need something to sacrifice. What we're looking for is really just the 2 inches or so of this strut right here. So this is the rebuildable type strut. This particular one came off of a 1985 Toyota Celica Supra. Now, it sucks to see a Celica Supra in the yard. I wish they could all stay on the road, but this one unfortunately had served its term, and I pulled this off of a junkyard car. I got 2 of them because obviously I need 2 of them for both struts. Now, the whole point of this, all I'm going to do is like cut this 2-inch piece off, and I'm going to weld it to the factory strut. Now, I mentioned I'm lowering this thing. All that I did so far is I cut 1 coil off the bottom of the spring. Now, hopefully that will get me maybe a 1/2 inch of drop, maybe a little bit more. In my car, the rear is a little lower than the front, so I think 1 coil was good. Now, this is the original strut insert. It's not really a rebuildable insert. As you can see, I've already cut it right there, and this thing was dead. It just didn't have any bounce back. It was completely shot. And this right here is a strut insert. This is the KYB XLG. This is kind of like a factory replacement. For now, I want my car just to ride kind of soft, kind of just a daily driver. Now, when I line these up here, you can see that the KYB is a little bit shorter. Now, I went with the shorter strut so that once it's lowered and I get everything set, I'm not already, you know, a little bit of the ways into the shock travel. Just imagine this would already be down to there, and now you don't have as much travel before it bottoms out. This one should have more usable valving to give a better ride on a lowered car. This particular insert is from a SW20 MR2, which is like your 1990 to 1994 MR2, and this is for the front of the MR2, which is the side without the engine, as it's going in the rear of my All-Track. Now, this here is the factory body. You can see that's what I cut. And now the strut insert will slide into here. And now I will take the top threaded portion that I cut off of the other Celica Supra strut, and I'm going to weld it to this body here. And then I'll have the threaded portion, which goes down, and this will thread on and keep the strut in the housing. And that's really all there is to it. Now we're going to go over all the steps Like I said, I've already done, partially one. I haven't finished it because I wanted to show you this portion of it, but I will show you cutting this and things to be careful of when cutting into a loaded and charged shock. I will show you this, cutting it off and kind of how I did it. You can do it any way that works for you. Then aligning and welding this. Now here's some of the tools that we're going to be using. McPherson Strut spring compressors. Definitely need these because the springs are under tension. You can get hurt bad if you don't have these. When you pull the top off, this thing will fire that way because of the loaded spring. You're going to need a various assortment of tools and new wire brushes if you're a rusty, screwdriver for hacking and prying at stuff, a ratchet, socket sets. I really like my little impact driver. You're definitely going to need something to cut with. I absolutely love my DeWalt 20-volt grinder with a cutting disc. And we're also going to need to smooth things out, so I've got a flap wheel here. Now I'm going to show you this here. I've got a couple pieces of angle iron and some large hose clamps. Now what these are going to do is I'm going to put them like this on either side and clamp them together, and this should do a good job of aligning these things perfectly once both sides are clamped together, and it'll give me a little space right there that I can put my initial tack welds on. So that's just to make sure that this stays straight, because if this ends up tilted in any way, the strut insert is going to bind and you're going to have a heck of a time. Now here we use the strut compressor tool. Go ahead and line it up on opposing sides, tighten it down just a little bit. You don't need to fully collapse the spring, you just need to remove the tension from the top hat, and then pull the nut off and take the top hat and spring off, and then remove the tool. Now with this next one, you're going to see me crack the nut loose first before I compress the spring, because the spring does add a little bit of tension and it helps to keep the strut body from turning. This one's still turned, so I had to vice grip it. And then we put the clamps on. As you can see, I put them on just a little bit and then get the bolt the rest of the way out, and the top hat comes off. After that, we're going to remove the gland nut, which is holding in the cartridge. A bunch of oil will come out because these things are filled with oil, and a lot of them are also filled with air, as you'll see the factory one from the Camry. As I cut it open, it's going to puff a little bit of nitrogen. So you want to be careful, make sure you're wearing eye protection. You can see these. Here's one that I cut and here's one that I prepared. Mine happened to have this little lip on the inside, sort of a ridge. Maybe you can see that. But this is nice. I'm going to use it as a reference mark to kind of grind down to, just so that I know that I have it even and level for both sides. Okay, so here is one of the new ones. Now I do want to note that I did modify these slightly. There's like a little button on the bottom. I went ahead and cut it off, and that will give me another, roughly 1/4 inch shorter. And then given the fulcrum and the ratio of travel on this, that should give me another 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of suspension travel before it bottoms out, just by simply removing that button. I'll show you how I figured out how much of this threaded portion of the Supra shock that I need to cut. That's what I did. Now that this is prepped with the button removed off the bottom, I'll drop this down in here, and we'll take the gland nut that we'll be using, we'll slide it down, and now this will show how much needs to be done. Now I test fitted these together, and this will not bottom out. It comes about 1 or 2 threads. It's just due to some corrosion, it just doesn't go down all the way. So I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that I account for that. And then basically all I'm doing is measuring from the lip I need to weld up to roughly where I know that it goes. Then I'm going to back off just a little bit, about 2 threads worth. And that's how much I'm going to cut. Now with that known value, I can just scribe a line. There you go. That's about how much it needs to be. Now I can chuck this up in the bandsaw and cut this piece off. Now I've added the chamfer to this right here so that I can get good weld penetration. I still need to chamfer this, but I've went ahead and I've smoothed this out, and I've made sure that it's roughly the same width by, locking a set of dial indicators here and, checking all the sides. It's seated all the way down. I'm going to take the piece from the Supra strut that I cut. We'll set this on here, and then we'll get the gland nut set in place. All right, another thing to note, this is the gland nut that came with the shock. It's not going to work. You can clearly see the difference in threads there. This is coarse and this is fine. So I have to reuse the Supra gland nut. And it comes with an oil seal because the other type was like an open cartridge, I guess. I kept this seal in here just because it does hug firm on this, and it also just kind of gives a better spot to bottom out on. I did remove it and see how it sat on the strut insert, and I didn't like it. So I went ahead and kept the seal in here. You may be able to get this to go down just a little bit farther if you take it out. I chose to leave it in. I don't think I'm going to regret that. Now, if I measured everything right, that before this bottoms out on here, it should start to increase the gap, meaning that this thing is seating on the strut, and when this is cranked down, it'll apply good force on it. If it were to seat before it comes up, then the strut could be loose inside there. Now we're getting pretty close, and there it is. It's seated on the insert, and as you can see, it's starting to create space, which means that when I weld this closed like this, then I'll be able to really crank down on this, and I'll get good preload, and I'll be able to ensure that this shock stays all the way down in the strut housing. Cool. I'm going to chamfer this, then I'm going to prep the entire other side, and then we'll get it all fitted up for welding, and that will be next. Now here's how I got them connected together. As you can see, just the angle irons on the side, and this will keep everything vertical. Got the hose clamps on there. Before I fully tightened it down, I went ahead and gave it a few whacks just to make sure that it's seated as much as possible. Now there are teeny tiny gaps here and there, and that's just because I flattened each edge with just a grinder or a flap wheel. I did it all by hand, so, but a little bit of gap is fine. It'll ensure I get good penetration. Even if a little blob does come on the inside, that's fine, because the actual shock body does have a little bit of room, so I can manage a little bit of misalignment. Slide this on, make sure that it's in place, so my gaps all the way around the outside there look even. So I'd say this is straight. Let's get some tacks on it and fully weld it. Now you don't have to have a fancy welding table and a TIG welder to get this done. What I would highly recommend though is the angle iron with the hose clamps, just to make sure that it's lined up to begin with, and then you can go ahead and stick this together with whatever you have, whether that be a MIG welder, a flux core, heck, even an arc welder will do that, with a stick, as long as you keep the amps down enough on any of them to not burn through. But because I have a weld table and a TIG welder, I'm gonna go ahead and fix this thing up and get to welding. So let's see how it turns out. Ah, shit, I missed a spot. Alright, so I went ahead and painted this thing. All I had was gray. I wanted black, but just didn't have it, so we're going to go ahead and assemble it. Grab the strut insert, pop it in place. grab our gland nut, get that in place. A little bit of gap that I wanted, perfect. I'm reusing the rubber isolator and putting the spring on here. Now since I cut that bottom coil off, it's just the teeniest, tiniest bit, kind of wobbly, like, I don't know, it doesn't really sit in there the same way, but once everything's together, it's fine. I go ahead and add the strut compressors again, and then cinch those down. Again, they don't have to go all the way, just enough to get the top hat on. And we're back. So I had to make some modifications. I needed to drill this opening out. I didn't have a drill bit exactly the right size, but I did have a step bit, so I was able to go in a little bit from each side. And then I got my trusty round file and went to town until it finally would slip all the way over. Now what that was all about is the factory strut had a slot, so it was kind of needed a D-shaped top hat, and this new strut is a fully round threaded piece. Well, now that that's out of the way, go ahead and get the top hat on, give the nut on top a final torquing, remove the strut compressor tool, and we're done. One newly rebuildable shortened strut. All right, I'm gonna do the other one off camera, and then we'll get to installing these things. And here it is, installed. Nothing too crazy, just a strut. I can install my rotors and new brake pads, hook up the brakes and bleed them, and I need to get new sway bar end links. I had to cut these off because they just wouldn't come out. They're the threaded type with an Allen key and a nut on the outside, and those never come off if they're more than a couple years old, so I had to cut them. I'm gonna order some, but for now I just zip tied my sway bar up out of the way just so it won't make any noise or catch on anything. We'll get this thing lowered down on the ground, and I'll get a quick picture of it tomorrow when there's actually light. Daylight savings time kind of screwed me here today. All right, we're gonna go on a quick drive around here, and we're going to compare and contrast the Camry with the cut springs and the KYB strut inserts versus actual coilovers like I have in my Celica. Now I know some people think that cutting springs ruins the ride. Hopefully this little drive along in the comparison with my Celica will kind of squash that. I don't know exactly what the spring rate is because I cut 1 inch off my coils, but like I said, it stiffened it up a little bit, and that may have just been the shocks and not even the springs. But we're going to go over the same road, same lane, same speed, and we'll compare this with the Celica. All right, here we go. As for the Celica, I'm on AE86 Megan coilovers, and these came with 8 kilogram per millimeter front springs, 6 kilogram per millimeter rear springs. I have the dampers set on full soft, and I've changed the front springs to a 6 kilogram per millimeter spring from Swift. The rears are still the 6 kilogram Megans, but I've removed the Megan coilover shocks for some KYB gas adjusts, just to dampen it down a little bit. And it's still fairly rough, as you can see. Alright, I think it's safe to say that was a pretty fair indicator that the Camry clearly rides a lot smoother than the Celica does. So even with cut springs, the ride is not ruined versus coilovers. Now granted, that coilover is not the perfect setup, but at 6K front, 6K rear, it should be more like 6K front, 4K rear. I will fix that in the future, but that's still going to be a lot softer than almost any off-the-shelf coilover system you're going to get. Most of these things are like 12-10, 10-8, or 8-6 if you get one that's like set up for street use, which in my opinion is far too stiff even for street use. I think the Camry looks absolutely great. I've driven it around, I've got a couple hundred miles on it, and I can report that it rides fantastic. The ride isn't 100% OEM, it is just the tiniest bit firmer, and that's because I cut the coils just a little bit. I got the ride height set just about right, maybe maybe another 1/4 inch lower in the front and it would be perfect, but I don't want to push my luck with this thing. As far as the inserts I chose, those KYB Excel Gs are OEM replacements, which is what they're advertised as, and man, the thing rides great. Overall, I would call this suspension like a stage 0.5 or maybe a stage 1. It made that much of an improvement, and it's still incredibly comfortable. Now granted, this mod is a little bit involved, but it is a great mod to do. I got it done start to finish, including the junkyard struts and the inserts, front and rear, all of it for under 200 bucks. So if this gives you the motivation to fix your own suspension, make sure to smash that like button. Make sure to leave me some comments to tell me what you thought of this mod, or even if you've done this mod yourself and like the way that I did mine. Hit the subscribe button for more cool content, more classic Toyotas, some American muscle, and some fabrication as always. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next video.